Thank you so much for this generous welcome and the introduction. In cinema, they say that when you're going to die, your entire life flashes in front of you. Listening to your resume being narrated by somebody else makes you feel like that's going to happen very soon. Right? Everything suddenly, oh my God, that's what I did, that's what I wrote. But thank you so much for giving me this opportunity, especially to the people who have been organizing this conference, because I do come wearing dual hats. On the one hand, I have an administrative position here as the new Dean of Research at the graduate school, but I also wear an intellectual hat, so to speak, which kind of does scientific research, if we want to call it that, in Germany, but along with other different partners. And I'm always very curious about which hat I'm supposed to wear. And I'm beginning with this personal narrative simply because when I keep on looking at the question that the conference puts in front of us, whether artistic research is different from scientific research, my immediate reaction is, I bloody well don't know. Yeah. And there is a reason why I don't know. It's not that I don't want to take a side, it's not that I don't want to quantify, it's not that I don't want to enumerate what the processes, pedagogies, structures and resources of doing research are, but maybe because there is a separate set of questions to be asked. And what I'm going to do today then is actually do what academics are very good at. I'm going to sidestep the question. I'm not going to tell you whether artistic research is the same as scientific one. But I thought that from the other work that I do, I might be able to introduce to you another dichotomy which has been very prevalent and which is set up as an opposition in doing research, but also especially in doing research which is geared towards development and kind of oriented towards questions of empowerment and uplift. And that is why the talk today I have is around infrastructures of living. Because what I really want to do is stage in front of you a different kind of an opposition that is often very prevalent, and that's between infrastructure and research. And I'm going to lay that narrative out in order to come back to the question of the distinctions between scientific and artistic research, if I may. So I'm going to begin on a very personal narrative. I remember when I was applying for this job and going through many rounds of interviews. In one of my last interviews, somebody on the interview committee looked at me and said, "You know, you sound like an intellectual. Are you sure you're ready for this job?" Because intellectuals apparently don't build infrastructure. Yeah? We live the life of the mind, we sit in mirror classes and we discourse, we profess, and that's why we get to be called professors. And seriously, it was a genuine question saying, are you sure you're ready to get your hands dirty? Or to get messy, to deal with people and reality and administration and structures? Is this really what you want to be doing? Right? You have a professorship, why don't you just profess? At the same time, while I was making my mind up, gearing myself up for this new challenge, I had academic mentors and supervisors who looked at me and said, "You want to be an administrator?" Right? Because administration or infrastructure building apparently taints knowledge. Or that it is something that we do because it's a professional hazard and has to be done on the side, as if infrastructure building in itself is not something that anybody would voluntarily want to do, except when it's thrust upon them, and then they try and figure out the most creative ways of fudging the results and getting it off your back. So I was caught between these two very strange dichotomies, where it was staged in front of me that I can either be somebody who builds infrastructure, or I can be somebody who does intellectual work, theory and research, and that the opposition was something I was asked to justify, both in terms of the community I was coming to, but also the community I already belonged to in some way. And I begin with this personal anecdote because I want to draw our attention to an uncomfortable relationship between research and infrastructure that emerges in a lot of different disciplines and practice. Repeatedly we hear that the two are pragmatically important for each other but continuously divided. So here is a bunch of names. For example, theories like Martha Nussbaum would offer that infrastructure gets undermined by intellectual work because it does not allow for the material conditions of survival to emerge and flourish. Network theorists like Duncan Watts would argue that research takes the lab situation as a reality, obscuring the conditions of the real world, and working with simulated realities rather than the actual messiness of life. Political economists like Partha Chatterjee have observed that the reification of research and knowledge always results in material structures which can be counterintuitive to the original ambition of research. While urban geographers like Paul Virilio would insist that infrastructure has its own logic, which is circumscribed by ambitions of those who do not necessarily engage with it. In the morning we had a question that John Johnston threw up in one of the panels about what do we do with politicians who do cultural theory and cultural policy and art practice, art policy as well, but without ever visiting a studio, right? What do you do when a lot of infrastructure is being built by people who do not really engage with its messiness? And the digital scholar Wendy Chun would describe it and said, we remain so seduced by software that we give away control and insight and questions of hardware to somebody else entirely. These have all been kind of different stagings that emerge between what you would call, this research and infrastructure dichotomy. These snapshots that I gesture to are symptomatic of the discourse that frames the questions that we are perhaps seeking to address today. It puts our attention into thinking about what constitutes research, how infrastructure gets managed, and how one can be in the service of the other. While this question of hybrid interaction and intersectional growth of research and infrastructure is important, for me it suffers from a self-indulgent impulse that I call codependent metaphorization. If the role of a metaphor is to take something that is unfamiliar or unknown and describe it in a vocabulary and through concepts that we are familiar with, then research and infrastructure serve as interreferential metaphors where each one seeks to describe the other, but only by looking at the ambitions and the agenda of its own. That there is a certain simultaneity, oh what a horrible word, there is a certain simultaneity to it which we must examine when bringing together research and infrastructure, because when the two do come together as research-infrastructure, or research/infrastructure, or research for infrastructure, or infrastructure of research. I'm narrating all of this because this should sound familiar to us when thinking about artistic research and research within the arts and research of the arts and artists as researchers. It's the same dichotomic trope which is kind of working out in that structure. So when research and infrastructure come together, there are two pre-wired responses to it. The first, that infrastructure limits research and that we need more and better infrastructure to realize our research ambitions. And the second, that research is an idealized state of knowledge which is incapable of dealing with the materialities and messiness of infrastructural and logistical developments. And even in fields and disciplines where research is particularly aimed at addressing infrastructure growth, this distinction persists. Now, I have no intentions of resolving the dichotomy or trying to rework this paradox. Because for me, the question of how research and infrastructure relate to each other is perhaps an important question, but a wrong question to begin with. It is a question that keeps us busy trying to ask what research is, what resources we need to invest in building a robust infrastructure. It's a question where the point of origin and the end point of the inquiry are exactly the same. They both result in producing matrices of better research and stronger infrastructure, suggesting that the end point of both research and infrastructure is good research and better infrastructure. Right? This completely circular self-referentiality that both of them produce by staging a false separation or a tension between the two is something I want to address today. And so what I want to introduce perhaps is a third angle to the equation, which is about life and living, which is where maybe primarily the questions need to begin. I want to propose that instead of thinking about research and infrastructure as in a bilateral relationship, we orient them towards specific questions that have material and real implications on the nature of life, especially for those who embody some of the most precarious conditions that we live in. I want to suggest that there can be no inherent value in research and infrastructure building, and that our continued obsession with methods, processes, evidence building, planning, logistics, and inspections are tools which cannot be judged for what they are, but what they are used for. And in order to do that, I'm going to take us through 3 different stories, drawing from post-colonial theory, from feminist intervention making, and from material history of media. And each of these stories, I hope to show that it is only in developing a vision of research and infrastructure towards a commitment of equality, equity, and change can we find values and tactics of shaping for the future. For my first story, I go to 1835 in India, when we were still a jolly good part of the British Empire, upon which the sun never set. Lord Thomas Babington Macaulay, whose name can possibly only be explained by the speculation that his parents did not love him enough. But he wrote a document titled The Minutes to Education, and he argued that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. For Macaulay, the native heathen was marked as a subject who has a past, but not a history, and hence needs to be educated in what he called the arts and ethics of English language. Macaulay's children became the first instance of what is derisively called Macaulay's bastards in India. They became the first set of administrative processes which were set up to support the burdens of the British Empire. However, Macaulay did a very strange thing. He said that in order to teach art, literature, ethics, and philosophy of the English language and temperament, instead of importing the books of the great literates from England to India and teaching them to read and write and appreciate literature, he taught the heathen to discover her history through 2 specific forms of infrastructure building. First was the ledger, the accounting system which would allow the heathen to navigate, count, account for, and be counted within the domains and logistics of the empire, was one of the first introductions that Macaulay makes to the Indian heathen. Right? Saying that before you learn to do art and literature and become a Pakka Britishman, you need to learn how to count. And you need to count and measure and standardize and have accountability based on the new structures and matrices that we are producing for you. For all of us in arts and humanities, this should sound very, very familiar, because this is a similar demand that keeps on coming up from bureaucrats and politicians over and over again, saying that in order to do your work, you will first have to make yourself transparent, accountable, and capable of counting and enumerating the work that you are doing. The second system that Macaulay puts up, and this gets really more fascinating because it's a different kind of an infrastructure, is that he introduces into India something called the anti-sodomy law, right? Or also which was called Jeremy Bentham's anti-buggery law. He was so scared about the heathen, who of course, as we know, has the tendency to break into song, dance, and sodomy. It pre-existed Bollywood. Right? The heathen, who has this libidinal excess that kind of just overflows and oozes out of his body, has absolutely no control or agency like the good Puritan British man does. And so he suggests that the heathen who works in the British East India office, and this is a picture by the Rux Media Collective, which I'm going to talk about very briefly soon, he says that to make sure that the heathen does not give in to the excesses of his impulses, he set up something called the Indian Penal Code, which minutely regulates the amount of distance that will be required between 2 male workers working in the British East India Company to avoid the temptations of the flesh. It sounds funny, but this was the first design experiment that the British East India Company did in trying to figure out what architecture, design, and social governance will look like if it is governed by a logic that is being transposed upon a specific geography. This installation by the Rux Media Collective is incredible because as the snapshot moves from the light to dark, it illustrates the possibility of a homoerotic camaraderie that Macaulay imagined in the unsupervised offices of work. Because it was only once the native had to be taught to be count. It was only once the native was taught how to count and be counted. It was only once the native was made into a moral being which can then appreciate the joy of floating like a cloud and chancing upon a host of daffodils. Right? This capacity of infrastructure building as a legitimate excuse upon which art, humanity, philosophy, and ethics were mounted is a relationship that I want to draw our first attention to. And we can kind of start unpacking from that afterwards. The second story I have is about the scope of what infrastructure can mean. I go to an incredibly inspiring artist called Jasmine Patheja, who for the last 12 years has been doing a project called the Blank Noise Project, which is possibly one of the only public discourse art projects we have that deals with questions of sexual abuse and violence on the streets of India towards women and towards queer bodies. The Blank Noise Project, for example, does this one project where it invites people who have been victims of harassment to donate clothes that they were wearing when they were harassed, put it up for a public display with one very simple idea, saying, "I never ask for it." It is a response to a series of judgments which have been misogynist, patriarchal, and absolutely repressive in India, where judges have repeatedly asked the people who have been victims of sexual violence, "What were you wearing when you got raped?" Yeah? And if that's what you were wearing at that time of the day, then surely you were asking for it. The Blank Noise Project does a horrifying survey, for example, which looks at teenagers in high schools, asking them when is it okay to rape a woman, and gives them 8 different criteria, including things like when you have paid for the date, or when she is sexually teasing you. And it's alarming that more than 40% of the teenagers, including women, think that it is okay for that kind of sexual violence to happen. That if you are performing certain kinds of actions, you were asking for it. Yeah? The Blank Noise Project does a different kind of an infrastructure building in this process. Recently, it set up something called the rape table. There are lanes in Indian cities which are literally called rape streets, because that's where women get molested. In the evenings, these are empty, there is no commercial occupation, there is almost no traffic. There are a bunch of men who hang out with a malicious intention of abusing women who might be walking there. People have to literally run through that 1 mile stretch in order to be safe, or at least go always in crowds and so on. And the Blank Noise Project decided to build infrastructure for communication and conversation, where they invited, largely through the social web, 3,000 volunteers to come together and sit on this lane with a table and 2 chairs, and saying, if you see something, say something. If you see an act of transgression, be an action hero. Call that person, offer them a cup of tea, sit down with them and saying, why are you doing it? Not with judgment, not with a pedagogic intention, but at least to open up a conversation, trying to figure out what's happening. It's been one of the most transformational projects that we have seen. These are images from the city in Bangalore, which is one of my homes, where you have continuously kind of looked at people who started talking about questions of gender, sexuality, patriarchy, and safety. And it was a conversation about infrastructure without infrastructure. Right? It is a no-cost project, literally. All it required was a Twitter hashtag and a series of volunteers. And Jasmine would insist, and she says, that when we forget to look at people as infrastructure, we are doing disservice to our understanding of what infrastructure can be. And that's the second proposition I have for us, is to expand the scope maybe of infrastructure and how its relationship with research is going to be. And the third story I have is a fantastic video which unfortunately I'm going to talk over because I don't have enough time, but I at least wanted to show clips of it to you while I talk over it. This is the story which is being told by Bill Morrison in this film titled The Film of Her. Yeah. Bill Morrison tells us the story of a clerk at the Library of Congress whose exotic desires lead to the discovery and preservation of an archive of Hollywood. It's the story of Howard Walls. Walls, when he was a teenager and staying at his grandparents' house, one Christmas snuck down into the basement and discovered his grandfather's stack of hidden pornography. He looked at the pornography collection, and there was one image of a porn star that just got imprinted onto his head, and that was being the center of all his desires as he was growing up. Walls eventually gets employed as a clerk at the Library of Congress, where the largest archives of film as well as published material was residing in the US. When he was a clerk, he stumbled across a huge amount of documentary material about films. So I'm sure this is familiar to you, but before 1910, moving pictures was not subject to copyright, right? You could not copyright it. So what distributors would do was they would take one image every 32 frames, and so each movie would be like 10,000 prints, which are then stored in the Library of Congress, and an intellectual property rights could be established over it. As a clerk, Walls stumbles across this particular archive to realize that somewhere within this archive is the face of that porn star who has been the center of his attraction and desire all his growing life. Now this archive was going to be destroyed. So individually, Walls takes up 1.2 miles of documentation, stores it into his house, only to go through and search for that pornographic desire that was in it. It's fortunate that he was that much of a dedicated pervert, because what nobody knew was that this was the only existing archive of motion pictures in Hollywood before 1910. He in fact becomes the libidinal restorer of an archive and gets an Academy Award in 1964 for special services to the motion pictures industry. And Bill Morrison takes up this restored footage and makes this film to kind of tell the story about how it was. But I particularly want to talk about why there is a need to rehumanize infrastructure as well as to rehumanize research. Research doesn't happen because you have a critical question that comes from reading Michel Foucault. Research comes from a space of passion, of anger, of commitment, of a complete unease with the world that you are living in. Infrastructures cannot merely be about building houses and building rooms and finding people who will run the administration. Infrastructure is not benign. It has a specific purpose, it has a motivation, it has a political commitment which needs to be thought through. And that brings me to the end of my talk today. That a lot of the times when we think about research and infrastructure as a dichotomy, we get obsessed about what is the work we do in order to do research and infrastructure. Maybe it's time to stop asking that question. We already know it. We have institutions which have been around for hundreds of years who know how to do the work for research and infrastructure. And maybe the time has come to start asking the question, what is the work we make research and infrastructure do? What are the kinds of ambitions, commitments, and aspirations which are being built into them? And I'm hoping that this completely separate detour can be mapped back now onto questions of artistic and scientific research. That maybe it's not a question to ask whether something is artistic research or scientific one, but what motivates it, what catalyzes it, and what are going to be its final forms and ambitions is perhaps where the conversations need to begin. So I'll stop there and thank you very much.
I have just one question based on what you just told us. You gave us a spellbinding story about how you would like to rehumanize infrastructure and research. Now, when you talk about rehumanizing at a place like this, you're talking about students.
Yes.
If I'm a student here in your new graduate school, and I'm sort of intimidated by both research and infrastructure, what would be the first thing that you would tell me?
Thank you. So I do want to say yes, students, but not only students. The faculty, the ecosystem, the amount of staff that works so hard at making sure that the student is cared for, nurtured is equally important within the administrative logic. But yes, if you are a student coming to the graduate school for the first time, there are only 3 things I can tell you. The first, that we do not have a pedagogy without you. There is no such thing as a structure within which you need to fit, but that it is our collective responsibilities as educators and administrators to build a pedagogy for you. And that's the good part about that is that ArtEZ is actually very, very good at doing it. The enormous amount of care that I see that instructors are putting into education already, and the ways in which they are thinking about how do we care for our students is great. The second thing I would want to tell them is that I don't care where they get placed. No, that's not true. I do actually worry very much about wherever students are going to find jobs or the ways in which the markets are shrinking. But what I really care about is not where they go, but the fact that they come back. Yeah. We've done our job well if you continue to come back to us at different points in your life, because you will never have completed learning and we will never have completed teaching.
We saw a few examples of that in the workshops and presentations this morning.
Yeah.
Those are just a few, the first two of the 2,343 things you would like to say to staff and students here. You're going to tell us many, many more things. Thank you so much for now.
Thank you very much.